Cool. So once again, welcome. I'm just going to do a quick intro of our speakers, and then we'll get started. So just to begin, Ching-In Chen is the author of The Heart's Traffic and co-editor of The Revolution Starts at Home, Confronting Intimate Violence Within Activist Communities. They are a Kundiman and Lambda Fellow, part of the Macondo and Voices of Our Nation's Arts Foundation writing communities, and has been a participant in the Theatrical Jazz Institute. They have worked in the San Francisco, Oakland, Riverside, and Boston Asian American communities. Ching-In currently lives in Milwaukee, is involved in union organizing and direct action, and is the co-coordinator of Milwaukee's Learn to Action Transformative Justice Group. Jessica Vega Gonzalez is an activist, teacher, and musician in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She currently works in administration at Core El Centro, a nonprofit natural healing center. She is a practitioner and certification in progress teacher of Iyengar Yoga at the River West Yoga Shala. She is the co-coordinator of Milwaukee's Learn to Action Transformative Justice Group. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ching-In Chen and Jessica Vega Gonzalez.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Hello. Hi. So thank you all for having us. Thanks for Alice and all the staff here for really welcoming us and gathering us and all the work it took to bring us here. We're very excited to be here. I'm Ching-In. This is Jess.
I have to go all the way up here. I'm Jess.
And our goal tonight is to share with you our stories and strategies for how we came to do this work, and also lessons and strategies from The Revolution Starts at Home.
And I'm taller than you. So the first thing we want to do is recognize the land that we're on. So we acknowledge that this event is taking place on indigenous land. And from an article that was given to me, I think from a faculty member at the university, it says it's the Sauk, the Kickapoo, the Potawatomi, the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, and the Ojibwe all can call their ancestral home, their ancestral home. So we acknowledge that this is taking place on indigenous land, and that as non-native people, we benefit from being on this land. We acknowledge that transformative justice is work that indigenous communities have been doing for centuries, both before and after colonialism.
So we just want to set the tone for our talk together tonight. We're really excited to be here again. And the book is about something really intense, something very challenging, but also something very hopeful and inspiring, which is communities coming together to end violence within our communities without resorting to police and the state. So what we wanted to do was we hoped that we could hold the space together to talk about this work. And what we usually like to do is, before we start, to just ask the room to hold the space together. And we would like you, and we did this a little bit in the workshop earlier, but we're gonna ask the larger room to do this tonight, is to think of one survival strategy you have for keeping safe, and to turn to someone next to you and share that with them. So we'll give you a minute or two to do that. And if you're not immediately next to someone, you could either write it down for yourself, or you could move closer to someone and make a new friend. So I'll give you just a minute or two to do that. Do you want to say something? Okay. Okay. So, thank you for doing that. I mean, I think what Jessica and actually I know the other co-editors of the Revolution Starts at Home believe is that we are kind of facilitators, or we would like to begin conversations about this, but we're not the experts of of this work. And actually, we think nobody is the expert of this work. I think we all are on this journey together. We're all learning from each other. And there's so many different paths and stories that have to do with this work. And there is now starting to be a body of commonly agreed upon, although, of course, always differences. So we just want to put that out there. And we're really excited to hear other stories and to see what other people are going to be doing with these ideas in the future. And so we just know that there's already a lot of knowledge in this room, and just wanting to honor that. And I wanted to share with you, and Jess will do it too after me, how I came to this work. When I was 17 years old, I began a relationship with a coworker at the movie theater where I worked, and my family freaked out. He was a Brazilian immigrant without what they considered a good job or good educational background. For the first time in my life, I lied to my family and snuck out of the house in the middle of the night to meet him. Eventually, my mother told me to sign a contract that I would break off my relationship with him or not be allowed out of the house to go to college, and I signed. I emerged from that experience resolved not to let anyone else control or decide for me whom I was involved with or what kind of relationships I chose to have. But I also became very protective and stubborn about my intimate relationships. It became hard for me to open up and let others know what was going on in those spaces of my life. 4 years later, after moving to a city where I knew no one, and while in another relationship I knew my family wouldn't approve of, I turned my back on my family and friends. We were stressed out about immigration status and making the rent. In the late afternoons and evenings, I canvassed for a rape crisis center with a group of women who were largely rape and sexual assault survivors, and my partner was driving a cab on the night shift. When our relationship became volatile, I had no one to turn to and no support system. At the time, I didn't feel part of any community. Part of my relationship experience was the feeling of being isolated. No friends, no place to go to outside of our apartment, no organization where I felt I belonged or that knew me and my history. Years later, when I started building a circle of activists who shared similar commitments to social justice, community had come to mean not having to feel alone and isolated, being hopeful that there are ways to figure out how to feel safe in whichever ways we needed to be. It meant being able to count on someone outside of myself, which was very hard for me to do. When a friend whom I had met through community work needed to escape from an abusive husband, we worked out a system that she would call me when she was ready, and I would drive over and get her out of there. And it worked. But I soon learned that not everything was that easy or simple or clear-cut. A good friend confided in me about her abusive relationship but wanted me to act to the outside world like nothing was going on, and we were all part of the same organizing collective. I entered into relationships where I didn't know what to do because we were doing this kind of work together. Sometimes my friends hadn't yet figured out what could be helpful or didn't want to talk about it. Sometimes I felt too far away to be of much use or help, or didn't realize the impact of what I was doing until much later. So that's how I came to the work, and that's really the seed of this project, which I'll talk a little bit about later.
Okay, so how did I come to transformative justice? And that feels like more like how did transformative justice come to me? Well, push comes to shove, I've moved to Milwaukee after medical trauma took me out of Peru. And then 5 months later, I was sexually assaulted by my friend's son. It wasn't the first time. Suppressed memories started coming to the surface. It was a gentle assault. I couldn't measure it in bruises and screams. In fact, I didn't scream at all. I kind of snuck out of the house afterwards and spent the weekend numb and in bed. My friend was well known in the community, and I was a newcomer, only connected to others through her. Her work was restorative justice, doing healing circles in schools, working with Marquette Law School. But when it showed up in her house, well, that was another story. Granted, a survivor herself, she initially believed me, but it created too much inner turmoil to know that her son had created harm. Denial set in, minimization, victim blaming. The easiest thing to happen was for me to disappear, and I did that. I pretty much did that for a while. Restorative. I was expected to restore everything to how it was before he assaulted me. I was expected to hang out in the same places as him if I wanted to connect with anyone who I had been connecting with in Milwaukee. I was expected to be in bullshit healing circles where I would eventually talk to him and hear about his story. I was expected to leave if I didn't want to be in the same space as him, and not the other way around. He wrote me an apology note that was clearly a homework assignment from his parents. I was expected to protect him from racist police officers because otherwise I would betray them all. I would betray them, and they quickly ignored the consequences of his behavior. Well, it took me another 5 months to realize that I shouldn't have to choose between my emotional, spiritual, physical safety and isolation. Community shouldn't require my blood and sanity. I spent hours crying in the corners of rooms and in closets. I clutched a pillow to my chest for days and months and years later. I did what I had to survive. I did what I had to feel safe again, and there's no shame in feeling safe. I came to TJ, Transformative Justice, because we need each other.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how the book project came into being. And basically, it started actually as a do-it-yourself zine between 4 friends. The 4 of us were all people of color. 3 out of the 4 were queer and trans. And we were all survivors of violence of some kind. We all had survived one or more forms of sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and intimate partner violence. And we were trying to figure out, how can we heal from this? How can we prevent this from happening in the future? How can we heal our communities and each other and ourselves? And we really were not finding a lot of resources out there that were helpful to us. And I will give you an example and it's in the introduction of the book. The vast majority of feminist or self-help literature addressing partner abuse offers few stories that looked and sounded like ours. Importantly, second-wave white feminism addressed cisgender men's violence against women as a system of oppression and not as a personal issue. However, paralleling the second-wave feminist movement's shortcomings in addressing the realities of women of color, queer women, and gender nonconforming people, these feminist manifestos failed to embrace an intersectional analysis of power that recognizes the multiple and complex identities we each hold in relation to privilege and oppression. Their critiques of gender violence also failed to address the disturbing paradox of prevalent intimate violence within activist communities, and the degree of collusion, refusal, and/or incapacity to address this urgent issue demonstrated even by anti-violence movement, quote-unquote, experts, unquote. Crucially, this analysis ignored a stark reality. Anyone can choose to abuse, anyone can be abused. In contrast, as feminists of color, we knew that our stories were much more complex, that race, class, gender, ability, sexuality, immigration status, and more contributed to our choices and our relationships. Although we believed in the power of breaking silence that many earlier feminists espoused, the reality of intimate violence within our activist communities was messier and much more complex. For many of us, The exit strategies and options that might be available to white, middle-class feminists usually did not work well for us. We wanted to find a way to stay within our communities and not have to leave. We hoped that the specific truth of our stories would be enough, as famously prophesied by the poet Muriel Rukeyser, to split open the world. So the four of us really started talking, and we all lived in different cities, and it was a 5-year project to really ask our communities and our networks, what are your stories and what has worked for you? And all of us had a prison abolitionist politic. And so Jess is going to talk a little bit about why that might be.
Yeah, so part transformative justice, we do not rely on cops or courts. And why is that? Just gonna throw that there. Throwing it out there. All right, anyways, so why don't we rely on courts and cops? And I am going to read from a part of the book, as we find it. Okay. And this is from Andrea Smith. 20 years ago, when I first became involved in the movement, even prior to the 1997 passage of the Violence Against Women Act, it was almost impossible to question the movement's reliance on the criminal legal system. In fact, it was difficult to even see the anti-violence movement as a movement. Most programs were almost entirely funded by the state. We had become a network of social service providers and legal system advocates. We had become so single-issue oriented that it did not even occur to most anti-violence coalitions to organize against police brutality, anti-immigration legislation, or military violence. Instead, many anti-violence programs support the police and state and militarism as solutions to gender violence. The assumptions that the criminal legal system was friend to the anti-violence movement went unquestioned. When the few critics there were would ask why we were supporting a system that was increasingly incarcerating poor communities and communities of color, we were silenced before we could even finish our sentences. Of course, there were many organized women of color anti-violence organizations and caucuses, yet we did not question the larger logics of the anti-violence movement. We strove to provide more inclusive services, but we did not question the actual services themselves. We created bilingual hotlines, culturally sensitive training programs, and ethnicity-specific shelter services. But we never asked ourselves if this approach was the best way to end violence against women of color. We organized for inclusion in the anti-violence movement, but did not question what we were trying to be included in. I think we were really trained growing up to think of the legal system as generally a good thing with these appendages that are kind of problematic. Like slavery was kind of this appendage that was problematic, is the way that we're kind of trained to think of it. And we're really recognizing that that's not true, that genocide has never been against the law, that slavery was a main was like central to the way that our legal system was built, and that it's not just these outlying pieces of the system that are a problem that we just need to get rid of, but that the actual system itself creates violence. That police, it's not police officers. There aren't like a lot of good cops and a couple bad cops. That the system itself is racist and is homophobic and is problematic. Right. Cool. Thanks. Go for it.
So we have this politic, and we also Jess talked about Annie Smith, and Annie Smith is the co-founder of Insight Women of Color Against Violence. And a lot of that knowledge that puts together, individual violence in what you experience as an individual with state violence. A lot of those of us who are co-editors really became of age, and we learned through being part of Insight in different ways. Some of us were members of different chapters. Some of us, went to some of the conferences that were organized. And they actually have done a lot of foundational thinking in terms of community accountability and transformative justice principles. But a lot of us were like, okay, that sounds really great in theory. We love this idea. How does it really work in practice? And when I talked earlier about opening up, asking for stories from different folks and our networks, that's really why. We really wanted to know, how does this really work? And so we started getting stories, and a lot of those are published in the zine, and some of them made it into the anthology. But as we started doing this work of gathering stories, we started really thinking about not just how does it affect individuals, but how does it affect our communities, and how do groups of people go about doing this work? And most of the time, it was not a 501c3 nonprofit. It was in an institution. There were just people that got together who were connected to each other in some way, who cared about, their friend who had just, experienced something that was negative. And we were really inspired by all these stories that we saw, and that's how the zine came together. It was a long process over 5 years, and then that was after it came out. And for those of you who are interested, it's on the Insight National website under resources for community accountability, and it's free as a downloadable zine. And it is a little bit, some of the things are republished in Rev at Home anthology, but a lot of it didn't get passed on because that's kind of our early process. And a lot of them are more individual stories. And when we had the opportunity, South End Press approached us to make it into a book, then that's really when we went after more of the community aspect. And I could talk more about that, but that's pretty much all I'm going to say right now about that.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about definitions: community accountability, transformative justice, restorative justice. I think that's what we're at right now. So community accountability, the first thing. So that is any strategy to address violence, abuse, or harm that creates safety, justice, reparations, and healing without relying on police, prisons, childhood protective services, or any other state systems. The way we've been using community accountability and transformative justice pretty interchangeably. But here's another definition of transformative justice, and this comes from Generation 5. It's an approach to respond to and to prevent child sexual abuse and other forms of violence that puts transformation and liberation at the heart of the change. It is an approach that looks at the experiences of both the individuals and the communities involved and the larger social conditions at work, an approach that seeks to integrate both personal and social transformation. And then restorative justice. In restorative justice, those who have been harmed take an active role in addressing that harm and or violence. And those who have caused harm are expected to take responsibility for their actions, to repair the harm they've done. Focus is on restoring, as much as possible, the situation to the conditions as they were before the harm. Okay, and so part of what we want to talk about a little bit is the difference between restorative justice and transformative justice, because those terms are used very closely together, and I think if we forget the difference, we're forgetting a really, really big thing, and we're really being complicit in some stuff around that. And so this is again from Andrea Smith. She writes, For the community to hold somebody accountable for the community to hold somebody accountable, they have to actually think that what happened was wrong. So therefore, you can't rely on a romanticized notion of community or even assume that a community actually exists. For a community-based response to be effective requires a political organizing component to it that actually creates communities that offer accountability, right? So what good is it if we restore the conditions back to what they were before if the conditions before were a bunch of crap? Like that, what's the point of doing that? We're just creating more violence. We're just keeping society as it is. What I am finding is very interesting, whatever that means, and incredibly difficult, is that transformative justice isn't something also that's outside of us. We have to transform ourselves. I'm just going to find another quote from in the book. Hold on 1 second. It says, "Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well? Just so you're sure, sweetheart, and ready to be healed. 'Cause wholeness is no trifling matter. A lot of weight when you're well. And are you willing to let the work transform you?" I think as we go into this, you more and more realize that that we all grew up in these societies, we all grew up in these systems, and we all learned them. And so part of creating the communities is changing the way I think, changing the way that we think together.
And that quote is from Adrienne Marie Brown, who is a badass organizer, really involved in Alameda Conference, etc. And it's in the book. Okay, so thanks for listening to us, kind of give you a lot of context and background. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna share from more of the center of the body of the book. And our whole goal is, because there's so many different paths and voices and stories related to transformative justice, and this is just, again, a beginning of a conversation, and there's lots of other conversations happening around transformative justice all over the place. We wanted to give you a taste of as many voices as possible and perspectives. And actually, Jess is also going to share something that she wrote, which wasn't in the book, but So I'm going to share a piece from It Takes Ass to Whip Ass, and it's from a sex worker roundtable in the book. And this part is from Miss Major, who is who's an elder and a trans woman of color who does a lot of amazing activist work. So the question is, what are ways you or other sex workers you know have found to deal with violence when it has happened, from cops, customers, lovers, and partners, child services, the medical and psych establishments, immigration, and other sources, without using the police? Miss Major: the thing we've learned about calling the cops is that we've learned not to call them, period. Most of the time, even when we have a problem with our partner, we hope they'll take our side. They don't. So we learn how to talk ourselves out of things. Or we'll walk close to the building to protect our back when we're in a crowd that might not be safe. With police, you simply ride that out. You'll hear the zipper or the belt unbuckle, and you know they just want a blowjob, usually on the hood. So you just position yourself so you can back away after. You never turn your back to them, because then they can say you were trying to get away and do whatever they want. Do you get a badge number and complain? No. You got no proof that he made you suck his dick. With lovers, you really learn to deal with it yourself. You try hard not to make it adversarial, not to escalate, and when it calms down, you manipulate the situation to put yourself in a safe space. For example, send him out to the store and change the locks while he's gone. If he's acting the fool outside your door, you can get the cops to come because they won't be taking any sides. If he, your partner, is inside, you've got to handle it yourself. You learn to think on your feet. The amazing thing is how a sense of humor and sarcasm can take you right across the bridge to safety before they ever know what happened. You've got to read a group to see who is the real agitator. Mob mentality always has one person leading everyone else on, and they're rarely at the front. You need to make fun of that person. Then he'll need to turn his attention to his friends and defend himself to restore their respect. Dealing with violence is different for everybody, like with hooking. There's folks who do it for survival, and some who do it because it's fun and exciting. Each of them will have very different experiences. I got involved with hooking because I thought it'd be exciting, and it was. It wasn't horrible, frightening, miserable, or annoying. So for me, the violence was what came along with prostitution. It was the nature of the beast. Going through that, I'd rather go to the hospital, but if someone tries to hurt my spirit or wound my pride, it's those things that I never get over. Being beaten up or raped, I have found that the mind is a wonderful thing. It can get you over and out of shit you never thought possible. Your body heals, the pain subsides, the thoughts slowly fade, and the mind replaces those thoughts with other things. When you've been hurt, friends have more than likely gone through similar things, so you can learn from them how to deal with it or hide it. It's often the same thing we did as a kid. Take time to pay attention to yourself, sort out what works for you. If you have a decent lover who'll give you a human response, they can help you. Agencies, psychologists, doctors, I don't think they give a damn. The longer you hold on to the pain, the longer they can milk you. The solution isn't what's going to get them the money. For example, a cure for AIDS won't get them the money, only the drugs will. AIDS is another form of violence. Society never realized that people with AIDS didn't have to die, that when these people died, a part of them died too. And I just kept going and did my best to help my friends. The older you get, the more you realize how true the cliches are. And so, there, but for the grace of God, go I. It could easily have been me, easily. This AIDS was brought on us. This wasn't a natural thing. I've had 2 lovers die of HIV, and people don't think about the guilt of the survivors. You ask yourself, why am I here? A question no one can answer but you.
So another story. This is in a section called Reclaiming Queer and Trans Safety. On October 29th, 2009, President Obama signed into law the first ever gender identity and sexual orientation inclusive federal hate crimes bill. Just a few weeks later, 2 young queer people of color were brutally murdered. Jorge Steven Lopez Mercado in Puerto Rico and Jason Madison in Baltimore, Maryland. On December 8th, 2009, 2 groups of mostly young transgender and queer people of color gathered in Brooklyn and San Francisco to mark both the federal policy and the murders as profound losses. The Audre Lorde Project Safe Outside the System, SOS Collective, an LGBTSTGNC, lesbian, gay, bisexual, two-spirit, transgender, gender nonconforming, people of color organizing project working to end police and hate violence in central Brooklyn, and Community United Against Violence, QUAV, a 30-year-old LGBTQI, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning, anti-violence organization working to create safety in the San Francisco Bay Area, teamed up to convene a series of public conversations under the banner Reclaiming Safety, to voice dissent against the idea that more policing, imprisonment, and prosecution will solve the devastating rates of murder and violence in our communities. We gathered out of a belief that safety comes from stronger relationships, more healing, and increased support, not more prisons or police or longer prison sentences. We did not want deaths in our communities to be used as a call for more violence. We feared and suspected this would be the case in the deaths of both Mercado and Madison, whose respective home communities of Puerto Rico and Baltimore are already primary targets of criminalization and persecution by the US government. On the San Francisco side, QUAV launched our first safety lab, a project where people come together to imagine and practice ground community responses to violence that do not rely on the prison industrial complex or its tactics of shame, punishment, and isolation. In the first lab, participants developed creative responses to murder, such as using art to reclaim public space, involving parents of people who have been murdered, engaging in compassionate, direct conversation with people who have been harmful, and creating a rapid response violence prevention network among friends. On the Brooklyn side, SOS convened activists, attorneys, and community members to discuss how victim rights rhetoric and hate crimes legislation have strengthened prison and police systems, and the need for community-based approaches to violence. For Quav, those early December conversations were the culmination of 2.5 years of brewing organizational change, from being a traditional progressive social service agency towards being a radical membership-based organization working to transform both incidences of violence and the political, economic, and social conditions that create violence. This journey was made possible by the sustained struggles for the prison industrial complex abolition and radical anti-violence organizations, such as Critical Resistance, Generation 5, and Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, among others, who have worked for more than a decade to reveal criminalization as an ineffective, false, and violent solution to interpersonal violence, and to emphasize the need for transformative community approaches to harm. Reclaiming Safety was a powerful example of above-ground dissent at a time when many considered a pro-prison bill to be an LGBT victory, despite the increased captivity and policing it would mean for poor people of color, including poor LGBT people of color. The gathering gave voice to the often marginalized and underground efforts of those of us who are not represented by the dominant LGBT national political agenda, particularly queer and trans people of color and poor people from these communities, and know all too well the devastating impact of law and order policies used to address interpersonal violence. Given the escalating US-backed wars and military interventions in Afghanistan, the US Gulf Coast, Haiti, Iraq, Palestine, and elsewhere being waged in the name of aid and security, the exploding number of people behind bars in the name of safety and justice, and the continued ecological and economic exploitation of our communities in the name of development, the need for alternative visions of safety and sustainability couldn't be more urgent. Reclaiming Safety was a small but important step in that long process. They go on to explain more about how the system is designed to basically keep some people safe and create more harm for others. And then they have a section here that has a list of things that they it's part of their strategic plan, so I'm just going to read from those. Liberation is a collective process. To embody our values of mutuality and share power, we shift into a non-hierarchical collective staff structure with 6 full-time staff members delegated to various programs, development, operations, and organizational development. I've got your back. We began developing and piloting a support and accountability structure in which each staff member works with a staff buddy to set and reach their personal, political, and professional development goals. Many struggles, one movement. To help build a strong LGBTQ voice in the movement to abolish state violence and win racial, economic, and social justice, we deepen our participation in key local and national alliances. We are still here to recruit you. We began building Quav Base through our first new member orientation in September 2009, training members in a core set of skills and frameworks for responding to, healing from, and preventing violence. Practice makes fabulous. There is little space for our communities to both imagine and practice non-law enforcement driven responses to violence. The PIC teaches us that we do not have the tools or intelligence to deal with violence ourselves. And unfortunately, we are often dealing with so much crisis that we don't have time to reflect on our habitual responses. This is why we create our Safety Lab series, to imagine and practice community-based, non-prison industrial complex responses to violence. You're queer. We're still here. Because of the high rates of intimate community and state violence that LGBTQ people face and the barriers that violence can create to our full participation in social movements, we have maintained our commitment to providing life-affirming support to individuals impacted by violence. Culture is a weapon. Art is a big part of queer culture, political movements, and community healing. We've drawn on the power of creativity to ignite change by teaming up with a local printmaking collective. We are our own safety net. In the context of escalating budget cuts and a widely felt economic crush, it's clear that we need to build a strong grassroots donor base that can keep our work advancing for the long haul.
Okay, so as you probably noticed, there's definitely a centering of queer and trans people of color in the book and communities of color, which is not to say that those communities, are especially more violent than other communities. But one of the things that we knew from being part of these communities is that a lot of times systems haven't worked for our communities. So we've had to create other things outside of those systems. And so we see these stories as roadmaps for liberation, as maps for other ways of being, and as organizing strategies and tools. And that's really what we were excited to learn about and to center. So there's actually a lot of, so this work is really complicated and messy and difficult and also very complex. And there's some pieces that are easier to share than others. There are a lot of things that it's very difficult to kind of summarize and give you a soundbite of. So I'll just tell you that, in this book, there are a lot of other pieces that I wanted to share or we would have wanted to share, but it was difficult. But I wanted to at least share one example, some snippets of a group that did some work around a specific process. And so this is the Chrysalis Collective. And going with the theme of tonight is beautiful, difficult, and powerful is the name of the piece. The Chrysalis Collective formed when a friend and member of our community experienced acquaintance rape by another local activist. Diane was a woman of color involved in several local organizing projects. Through her activism, she befriended Tom, a white male grassroots organizer working full-time in primarily poor people of color communities. As their friendship grew, Tom expressed his romantic interest. Diane made it clear to Tom that she was both unavailable and uninterested. A few months later, Diane felt that Tom betrayed their close friendship by manipulating her into sexual situations that she did not want. Their friendship abruptly ended. After several months of confusion and anxiety, Diane painfully realized that she had experienced acquaintance rape. Aware that the state and its prisons are the biggest perpetrators of violence against our communities, Diane looked elsewhere for solutions. As infuriated and upset as she was with Tom, Diane knew that putting him in jail would not bring about the healing, justice, and peace that she wanted for herself, Tom, and the community. She gathered her close friends and formed the Chrysalis Collective. We were a group of women and trans folk of color with experience organizing around reproductive justice, queer health, racial justice, gender justice, youth issues, immigration rights, and food justice. At that time, we didn't know how to build a transformative justice collective, how to make Tom accountable, what TJ models already existed, or what our next steps might be. So the first step they did was to gather and form a survivor support team. And these are some of the questions they considered. Whom does the survivor and her allies want in the SST? What are the goals of the SST? What are the expectations, skills, commitment levels, and availability of the SST? What resources does the SST need to prepare and gain confidence for the work ahead? So they basically had a 2-day gathering, and they created separate goals for Diane, the SST, Tom, and their communities. And some of the goals were to help Diane seek a healthy, healing path, join a survivors group, not blame herself for what happened, and keep her journal. Have Tom agree to work with the accountability team, or the AT. We plan to organize, seek counseling, share with friends that he is in a TJ process, and admit to the assault. Ensure that the SST and AT commit to a survivor-centered TJ process, recognize Tom's humanity, create a community-based alternative to the state, and eventually share their experience with community organizers and groups. Their next step, step 2, was to form an accountability team. And some of the questions that the accountability team asked themselves were, what experiences do they have with sexual assault, transformative justice, or community work? What other skills could they offer the TJ process, e.g. patience, clarity, compassion, political vision, commitment? What leverage do they have in the community? For example, positive reputation, community, elder, financial resources, connections. And this is more like speaking to who is Tom really going to listen to and take seriously in the work. Would it be helpful if the AT was drawn from diverse communities across lines of race, gender, sexual orientation, class, organizational affiliation, and age? In our case, and this is the Chrysalis Collective speaking, the aggressor was a middle-class, straight, white male with a pattern of not listening. Yay, no, just kidding, my favorite. We felt that an AT led by working-class women of color would be less effective than a predominantly white and/or a male AT. And finally, did they know Diane and/or Tom? So basically what happened is the survivor support team contacted folks individually on the list, and Diane chose to keep their identities confidential. And so without divulging identities, the SST informed the potential ally that a sexual assault had occurred in the community and that the survivor was starting a TJ process. We shared the SST's framework for rape, sexual assault, and TJ, and made sure that folks shared a similar analysis. And although most folks did not have much training or experience with the TJ process, we emphasized to them that they could still join the AT, pool their skills, and learn together. So basically, they vetted 4 activists who shared a radical political vision and a strong gender justice framework. And the next step was defining the relationship between the teams. So there were 2 separate teams, one around the survivor and one to work with the person who caused harm. And then in this step 3, they outlined clear expectations and roles for each group. But they kept open the possibility of shifting them if they needed to renegotiate. And so the survivor support team focused on Diane's needs and desires throughout the TJ process. They educated themselves about TJ by checking out resources and books, zines on the web and in our communities. And I'm going to email Alice a whole bunch of resources, so if people are interested, hopefully they can get in contact, and because there's a lot of resources on the web now. They supported Diane's healing process as an individual and within the TJ process. They initiated, monitored, and evaluated Tom's accountability process through the AT, and they communicated between the AT and survivor, making sure the AT knew Diane's needs and gave Diane updates of the AT's process while respecting how little she should know with respect to her healing process. What the accountability team committed to was they committed to a survivor-centered practice at all times in their work with Tom. They educated themselves about TJ with an eye towards supporting Tom's transformation with compassion. And they had to balance taking the time to be fully prepared with the urgency of transforming his behavior, which seems always to be the case. So they worked directly with Tom to achieve accountability and transformation. So as a group, they had to gain Tom's trust and commit to honoring his humanity. For example, they consistently reiterated their commitment to TJ rather than to legal or retaliatory justice. And they also basically acted as the intermediary between Tom and the survivor support team. Anyway, this is a very long process, and I just wanted to share with you some of the steps of the accountability process, and you can, I guess, read the rest of the article. Jess.
Okay. So we were kind of structuring this as like kind of an individual story and then a community story and then a individual story and a community story or whatever. And so I'm going to share some of my story. So if I cry, that's okay. But I'm just warning you. And just to give a little background, well, I'm going to read a poem that I wrote last June. And I actually wrote it on the anniversary of my tia Nordia's death. My mom's side of the family is from Nicaragua, and her sister was fighting in the Nicaraguan Revolution and was killed. And I mean, there's a lot there, but many of the soldiers who were fighting for the dictator in Nicaragua were trained in the U.S., trained by the military, the U.S. military. So there's some of that in here, and there's also I was witness to domestic violence incident / hate crime that month, and then my own like sexual trauma. So I'll go ahead and read this. It's called Today. June 13th, 33 years ago. She gave up her life to fight against poverty, injustice, oppression. I don't know if she knew the cost nor the kind of ripples it would make. June 3rd, 10 days ago, I stand up against it too in a sleeveless gray shirt and naked feet. Stop. A glass jar in the corner of the closet filled with sage, smoke, and secrets. 2 poems from mother and friend, a congested throat trying to release the locked voice. Stop. I feel his face in mine. I lay down and I feel his body on mine. Body remembers what the mind must lock away safely. A sore jaw and tight IT bands. I am safe, she says. But does this mean what I think it means? A long, intentional pause, a gentle, clear, and honest answer. Yes. Yes, it does. What does it change? Everything. Put it on a paper in a glass jar with sage smoke in the corner of the closet contained next to flowers and pictures and drawings and pain. You look like her, Jessica. Eyes rimmed red, feet on the ground, practice the roots. You know, she died along with 30 other young people bombed from above and bulldozed over by soldiers trained and endorsed in the land I now live. They can't even pronounce her name. Abuelito found her head a month later because she was the only one of 2 women and the only with short hair. He carried her head and a limb from Managua to Esteli to be buried with family. You may rape me, America. You may yell in my face and threaten me. You may even kill me, like you killed my tia Nordia. But no punishment you might inflict on me is worse than the punishment I put on myself for conspiring in my own diminishment. I stand with much deeper roots, with wind in my screams and fire in my gut, Kuan Yin in my hand and Guadalupe on my back, rosaries around my neck, prayers from black angels binding and casting out all evil in the holy name of Jesus, fingers digging in my back ribs, salt and holy water in a circle of candles, singing in tongues, drumming and swinging with big hair, borrowed sweatpants. I pray that Jessica is safe and keeps coming back so I have someone to play with. Stacks of court orders and pictures, stolen whiteboard lists, changing each day, demanding the first time I call this place home. I am bringing it all, surrounded in light blue light.
Okay, so the last piece we're going to read from the section is a poem by Vanessa Huang called Manifesto. We believe in home, all beautiful. Home enough bellies, breathe and sigh. Enough skin, rest, dance free. Enough courage, carry all life. This a home, no landlord, tenant, bank, imagine. No passport, jail, shelter, claim. no developer, gift, no reparation, furnish. This home, free, a body crossing, and shame. Free, a memory break, no shame. All beautiful. This home, pray for lost and stolen. Home now, free, a traveling fence, finger in sky breaking open. Free enough, many, home, many body, home and whole together. Home, safe and full, spirit prayer. Body prayer, full desire. Home, wider song and cooking. Wider shape, a wood, brick, and stone. Home, wider shapes weave together. Full and wide enough spirit, return to body. Enough whole body, each body, heart body, holy, beautiful. Holy, so holy, body, homeless, turn home again. We want home, all beautiful. Home alive, so alive, heart brave, thunder, shake out a hiding. So holy, beautiful, and so holy, brave. Every body home, and every body free.
So thank you all for listening. We just wanted to throw out some of the questions that we're still asking in this really messy process. So one of the questions is this idea of forced compulsion being a good idea. And I think what the idea behind that is basically like, if we're gonna ask someone to be accountable and to have these conversations with us, like, can we force them to do that? And if we can, what does that mean? And if we can't, then what does that mean? And is it a good thing to try to force someone into a conversation or force someone into a certain kind of accountability? Or is that not a good thing? That question is really deep. Another question that we keep coming up with is like how to do this in like very small communities. Like super small communities where everyone knows each other. How do you create systems where people won't burn out, or people can be in different spaces that are safe for each person? And what does that look like, and how can we create accountability and safety in that? Another question is about survivor-centeredness, because survivor-centeredness is such a big part of transformative justice. But is survivor-centeredness always the best way to go about it? Like, what if the survivor wants you to go and beat up, like, the perpetrator, the person who caused harm? Like, what if, like, what the survivor is asking for seems to you or seems to the group like something that is totally whack and not like good for anyone? Like, what do you do? So that's another question that has always come up. And we're going to talk about, and I think we just wanted, as we're ending this, a little to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Milwaukee. Do you want me to talk about it? Okay, I'm going to talk about it. It's very new. But it actually, a lot of it comes out of my story. So because like I shared at the beginning a little about like how I came to this work, and that was really like having been assaulted by a friend of mine's son. And this friend being someone who does a lot of restorative justice and does all these things and does like anti-racism work and all these like really great things, but there was, I don't know what you call it, a blind spot. There was resistance, there was tension, there was something that, where she and her son were not taking accountability for what had happened. And there was a lot of victim blaming, a lot of that kind of stuff. And I found myself very isolated. And around about a half a year later, people started noticing that. And questions started coming up. And I guess I just decided to tell people and just be like, fuck it. So, and I think from there, folks started asking questions and being like, what can we do? Like, how do we shift things? And so there was a group of people who came together and started talking about how to really address this instance, this violence that had happened. And then we realized that we had no idea what to do. We had no idea how to talk to each other and no idea, like, really how to do this. And so what we've started doing in Milwaukee is these learn to action groups, where myself and Ching-In are just basically facilitating workshops that folks sign up for, do some readings, look at some resources that we've been looking through ourselves, and then coming together for like 3 hours on a Sunday, and talking about it and seeing what comes up and looking at our privilege and trying to see where we need to change our own ways of thinking and seeing how we can, I think the goal is really to see how we can connect to each other in a way that'll create a community where people are safer and more accountable and not isolated. So that's just a little bit about what we're doing, what we're trying to do.
And what we want to say about these learn to action groups they're happening everywhere. When we were putting together our group, we looked at a syllabus that came from Toronto. Actually, I know those folks. And there was a group in Brooklyn. So there's people all over the place that are doing this in very exciting ways. And the reason why we wanted to put those questions out is these are questions that a lot of us are grappling with, and there are lots of different answers and thinking. And I don't know if there's a solution, but these are things that we're hoping you can also help think about and get engaged in. And so just the last part is what Jess was talking about. And then we're totally open to engage with you and talk with you if you have questions. But we really wanted to end with this, and this is a quote by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. And there's an interview with her in the book. But this is why we think we do this work. And what she says is, self-care includes holding each other accountable because we are interconnected. Loving ourselves includes learning how not to harm each other. Loving ourselves includes disrupting violent patterns in our homes, in our community building spaces. And I think that's why we do the work we do. And thank you for listening to us.
I know this is a small space, but we're speaking on the mic, so your remarks and comments and questions can be recorded. So we'll just pass this amongst ourselves. If anyone wants to kick things off.
I just want to ask a question of clarification. The very first question about the forced talk, were you talking about the victim or the perpetrator?
I think a lot of times the victim or the survivor is the one who wants to talk about it. So often it's talking about the perpetrator, the person who caused harm, not wanting to look at that, not wanting to admit it, or trying to find ways around that. I think that's what happens more often than not. But I think the same thing is true if it's the survivor as well. If the survivor does not want to be a part of it, like, what do you do? You know, like I don't know, like, yeah.
This is what my voice sounds on the microphone. It's pretty intense. You all did it all night. That's great. So let's say that we're extraordinarily excited about this work. And let's say that we're in Madison and we're me. So how can I... or other people who are also interested, let's say. How can we get involved? And let's just say we're really excited. Thank you.
Do you know other people that are also very excited? Because you could, together, I mean, one of the things I will say that there are groups like Philly Stands Up, Philly's Pissed, that are kind of like a known entity, and people do approach them to help. But I think in a lot of cases, it seems like it's more about shifting the wider culture. And Co-op is a good example. There are some other examples that you could look at in the book we can talk about. Because I think that a lot of times the person who caused harm, you might not be the person unless that person's willing to listen to you, you know, to be like, hey, listen to me. Because if that person doesn't know who you are, they may not really, take what you say seriously. But I think that there's a role that we all have, and it's a matter of kind of, and we can do some, since you're in the workshop, we could do some visioning tomorrow about the specific community and what are things that people are excited to work on and build connections. But I mean, I think that that's one, I think, lesson that we've seen through a lot of the stories, but that's not always the case necessarily. And I think the Philly example is a good example. If you're already doing a lot of great work and people know you and you build within the community as someone that people can go to, then I think that, you could be a more general resource for folks. Did I answer your question? Yeah. We could talk more about it, yeah.
Hi. So I really, really enjoyed, this is really interesting, especially the part about like restorative justice and what are we restoring, like not questioning that like blew my mind. I was wondering, we're talking about like systems that, like the criminal justice system or court systems or police or even government, schools, these things. Like, do you feel like there's a room, are there bridges that can be made? How do you work? I mean, we're at a university, right? Like we're having this conversation at a university, So I'm just wondering what systems can be made. Do you get what I'm saying? Like bridges and what work can be done within or connections to, or do you feel like that just doesn't happen or it's not authentic? I don't know.
Well, good question. I think that, so just to be clear, we're not saying like, hey, survivor, if you go and call the cops, you're a sucky person. Because I mean, I think what we know is that the reason that's the first response, like when in our first session, that was everyone's immediate response, and that was a very clear response. It's because that's kind of what we're socialized to do, and there's not really a very great alternative. Someone in the workshop today was like, well, it's so hard because basically you have to like eradicate all the systems of repression before, So I think I think this is interesting because I was just at an event, this anti-Valentine's Day event, which was it's an alternative approach to dealing with violence. And there was someone there who was an ex-prosecutor who ran Milwaukee's, unit around domestic violence. And it was really great to talk to him. And he, was talking about how the system wasn't working. But I feel like there are also places where we can be knowledgeable about what the systems are in terms of whether they have resources and not just totally write them off wholesale. But it's a very complicated question, and I think that it's something that I think almost in a case-by-case basis in terms of dealing with what the survivor needs and being survivor-centered. We could talk more about it too.
And this, Ching and I were talking about a little earlier today also, like police officers, are they part of our community too? Like, as in, like they're people, right? They're like, they go home, whatever, I don't know what they do, but like they're someone's partner sometimes, like they're people and they live where they live among us, whatever. Like, are they also a part of our community if we're creating community responses? And what does that mean when they're also tied to institutions? And it's just like really complicated. And I think the way that like me individually, like I've been working with it is that I've really like have just been searching for like conscious people who have those resources, who might be in those institutions, but it's really more about like their consciousness around it. And insofar as that connects me to institutions, that I feel safer when I know that the person who is tied to that institution is conscious and aware of what's going on and sees it as a bigger picture and understands the systems that are in place. But it's definitely like a beast.
I guess in places where I've seen accountabilities processes attempted, one of the real challenges becomes the sort of low incentive for perpetrators to participate, because an entry level step is for them to admit being, more or less in the wrong. And one of the things our communities, especially insofar as they're like participating in an anti-oppressive mindset, are really good at is disliking oppressive behavior. So, we all love to like run down rapists, right? Like that's stuff that we will not tolerate. And so there's very low incentive for those people to say, yeah, I fucked up and I'm going to change. And I guess I'm curious, because that's a huge process for them to participate in, how you think about both building up the empathy of communities to allow for people to admit to mistakes and begin to change, and also how you think about developing this sort of long-term capacity for actually completing a process that takes that much time and energy.
I mean, I think that's what the heart of the work is that you're talking about. And I think that I think that one process that I have seen people use is shaming. And, that's sometimes people have to do that to get people to come to the table. I think they're varied in terms of responses, and I do think it's a case that, and actually, there in the zine, there's an article by Kara from Seattle. And are you familiar with the article? Because you're nodding. Because they actually talk about 3 case studies, and actually, we had Alice copy the 10 principles for y'all, but you can actually go. It's available online. It's also in one of the Inside anthologies. And they actually talk about 3 case studies. The first case study, there was a combination of what I talked about before, having someone that person respected within the organization talk to that person, and as well as some I would call more of like shaming techniques. But in the second and third examples, basically, they focused on the person who caused harm, and you could call that unsuccessful, or you could call it they basically decided to redirect their energies towards shifting that particular community's culture around consent, around sexual violence. And I think that points to what you're talking about in terms of a larger shift in the community around whether or not those actions are acceptable or not, or welcome in the community or not. So it is a very long-term process. And I've seen, actually recently, I've seen some like public namings happen where folks have said like, we've been engaged in this process, and the person who caused harm just isn't being accountable, so we're naming the person. And we're asking, actually I saw this, it was kind of like I don't know if they called it a boycott, but it was pretty much like a community boycott, and they asked organizations who worked with that individual to basically hold him accountable, and they named him, and they said that this is the reason why, because we've been working with him on an accountability process and he hasn't been being accountable. And we could talk about whether we think that strategy is effective or not. This happened, I think, a couple of months ago. So I think all different types of strategies and techniques are being tried. And do you have something to say? Okay.
And just in terms of like sustainability, I just think of like the Phillies Pissed and Philly Stands Up, where they separate the groups so that one is centered on the survivor and the other is centered on the perpetrator, and then really being able to separate that so that people don't get burnt out and can really focus their energy. So that's another strategy we've seen people use. So.
Well, I do want to remind folks that now that they've heard excerpts from The Revolution Starts at Home, that we do have copies of the book on sale back here. Rachel's got one up in the air. And I think we'll take a few minutes to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your time with us. So thank you so much.